The Beyond Africa podcast. Welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast, the only platform where experts share their views on African issues. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast with me, your host, Ngalim Bernard. We are focusing on Cameroon again, and as I've told you before, we are doing this because Cameroon is going through a crucial election period. And these elections are crucial because the president is 92 years old. He's been in power for 43 years as president. Before then, he was prime minister. And now he is running to succeed himself. If he runs out the new mandate, he's going to be 100 years. And of course, 50 years in power. That is going to be a magical milestone that has never been achieved anywhere else. But here today, we're talking about U.S. foreign policy in relation to these elections and the American diaspora and what we could expect from the United States as it stands between the United States and Cameroon relating to these elections. My guest today is no other person than Ambassador Tibor Nagy, who has been on these issues. He's represented the United States in relations with Cameroon, both at the U.S. mission in Cameroon and also as the Undersecretary of State for Africa. He was there in 2018 and he had some impressions. Since then, he's had impressions and opinions about what is happening in Cameroon. So we're going to hear from him the temperature or what is happening within the United States. He's no longer in power, but at least he has an idea of what is happening in Washington, D.C. So you're welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast, Ambassador Tibor.
Thank you very much, Bernard. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
I'm excited to have you here official on the program for the second time, but I know that beyond that, we've had other conversations in the background that are really interesting.
And I'm glad you underscored the fact that I am not speaking for the United States government. I hope I'm speaking for what a lot of people who support democracy and freedom and liberty do believe, you know, on the U.S. government side, both in the executive and in the legislative branch.
Absolutely. And there has been movements between diplomats, grassroots activists, and Cameroonians in the United States around these elections in Washington, D.C., talking with diplomats, talking with think tanks, talking with NGOs. Because as I mentioned in my introductory note, this is a very crucial period for Cameroon. As a lover of good governance, democracy, interesting and good relations between the United States and African countries, you have always been on top of these issues. What is the temperature around Washington, D.C., as you can perceive for the moment?
Well, remember, the Trump administration is still really just getting started. There are a lot of key positions which have not been filled yet, including the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. We had a very, very effective and professional person acting as the Assistant Secretary, Ambassador Troy Fitrell. He has now retired. His position was filled by another who I believe is a very high-level professional, Ambassador Jonathan Pratt. But there's not a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary. So a lot of other positions remain unfilled. So the best way we can say it is that, especially on the State Department side, it's still not operating on, as we would say, on all 12 cylinders, because at the same time, the State Department is undergoing a very significant reorganization. As we know, USAID has been cut back and brought into the State Department. Secretary Rubio himself is personally very much involved in a number of, critically important issues for the United States of America. So a lot of what I would say is routine business for the State Department is just not going to be getting the kind of attention it needs until, these other issues are settled. I'm always a realist and I always try to tell the truth. So right now, Cameroon issue is not getting the kind of attention it would normally be getting into, 1 or 2 or 3 years of an administration.
Absolutely. And most observers are a little bit worried on why Senate and the Congress had to go on the August recess while President Trump's appointees are waiting. But it looks like it's a normal process for all administrations and Congress to have August on a low playing field.
Yeah, it's a political process, and there's always political games being played, just like everywhere in the world. So, the Congress will come back. I'm very much hoping the positions will be filled. I mean, I was back there earlier this year on an acting capacity as Undersecretary of State for Management, and I left hoping that the position would be filled soon. There was again, a very competent, qualified person who has had Senate hearings, but the Senate has not yet voted to confirm. So that is going to remain, like I said, until all the positions get filled. A lot of these issues are just not going to be looked at closely.
Yeah, this is 8 months into President Trump's second mandate, and there is still a long time to go. You can call it that way because it's a 4-year mandate, and things go very fast in DC. So, those who are hoping to have the United States forcefully make statements about these elections in Cameroon need to pull a long-term game and expect the United States to react maybe.
Yeah, don't be expecting that because
Yeah.
what happens at times like this is that the policy tends to be more driven by the U.S. embassy in the country. And, to be honest about it, and having been ambassador myself, I know this, is that the U.S. embassy does its best to maintain cordial relations with the host government because you have to get the work done. So oftentimes the U.S. embassy is a little bit warmer in its relations with the host country than what Washington normally might want. So, we'll just have to see how it goes forward. But, I mean, my point of view, anybody who takes these elections seriously is very, very misguided.
We'll talk about your point of view on the elections in a moment, but I also want to talk about the embassy relations in Yaoundé at the moment. But Secretary Rubio is one of those senators who took the Cameroon question very seriously.
Yes.
When he was in Senate. He
Yes.
sponsored some of the resolutions, and he's
Yes.
been very active on the diplomatic front. Is that an indication that he might be more open to discuss on these issues once the temperature starts setting down and he's more...
I hope so. I think I've said before that when I was Assistant Secretary of State, I passionately care about the Cameroon human rights issue in the Northwest and Southwest. And I was delighted that he was the only serving senator who called me personally on the phone to ask me about the situation. We'll see. I mean, right now, obviously, the Secretary of State is there to implement the president's foreign policy. So even his ability to act is at the pleasure of the president. That's how our system works. But again, when things settle down, and we'll see how this quote unquote election unfolds to see if at that point the secretary may get involved when the conclusion happens to be what everybody knows the conclusion is going to be.
Advise me if I'm wrong. Does the Secretary of State also advise the president on international issues?
Absolutely, and it's a two-way deal. I mean, the secretary is the chief policy advisor of the president on foreign policy, and as we know, Secretary Rubio is not only Secretary of State; he's holding down the job of national security advisor, kind of like what Kissinger did. So yes, he is the primary foreign policy advisor for the president. Of course, with a president like Trump, he very much has his very strong opinions, and at the end of the day, you can give him all the advice that you want to, but he's going to make up his mind, and then you do what the president wants to do.
Absolutely, and it appears Rubio is the most competent person around DC this time around.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. For me, it was an absolute honor and delight to work for him.
That's good to know. When the electoral core was convened, the embassy issued a statement calling on all parties to respect the law, ensure that the elections are peaceful, transparent, and credible. This is not strange. These are the calls that we always hear from the United States all the time. So that statement, does it come as a routine protocol, routine activity just to show that there is a U.S. embassy present in Cameroon, or could there be some teeth to it? Because the statements always come, but the results are always the same.
Yeah, the statements pretty well expected. I mean, if the U.S. embassy remains silent, no matter how how unserious the elections are going to be, it would seem like that the United States of America is condoning violence or condoning indifference to the democratic process. So, that kind of a statement is fairly routine in that kind of a situation.
So it's routine, and it speaks of the United States' intention to promote good governance, democracy, and human rights everywhere they are. And President Trump's mandate is about promoting good governance, democracy, human rights, but also advancing American interests and not only the interests of the foreign country. So we have not yet seen this play out. It's just 6 months. How do you expect that to play?
Yeah, Bernard, President Trump's number one, number two, number three, number four, order, whatever you want to call it, is to promote America's safety, security, and interests. The promoting democracy, human rights, that is secondary. And one thing I have to say is President Trump at least is honest about it, because other presidents may say, oh, democracy is number one and America's interests are secondary. All I can say to that is hogwash. It's pure hypocrisy to pretend otherwise. I remember President Biden, when he was running for the presidency, he said, Saudi Arabia, I'm going to really show them, who they are, what they are. And then he becomes president. He goes hat in hand to Saudi Arabia and does a fist bump, with MBS. So, yeah, let's get real. Whatever any president says, their number one task is to promote American interests, and the other stuff is always secondary.
Yeah, as you said, Ambassador Troy was very active and very competent in communicating this message. I followed his months in office, and while he made a statement to the diplomatic corps, to African governments, he said the administration's goal here is clear: to increase U.S. exports and investment in Africa, eliminate our trade deficits, and drive mutual prosperity. So driving mutual prosperity would require that there is stability, there is peace, so that everything can work out well. Within this framework, I know Secretary Rubio has been focused a lot on Russia and Latin America. We've seen very limited movement in Africa. I also know that President Trump has mentioned about working on Somaliland. But when it comes to elections, we've not really seen the government actually go forth, like making strong statements.
Yeah, again, we go back to the point that the administration is not fully staffed. The State Department is going through a huge reorganization. So it's not just routine. You can see how active President Trump's special envoy for Africa has been. Mr. Boulos. He has been able to achieve the first kind of a peace agreement between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He's gotten involved in a number of other issues. I was very hopeful that there might be a breakthrough on Sudan, and there were press reports that he's held, confidential meetings with General Burhan in Sudan. I hope that's true. We were supposed to have a meeting of the Quad in Washington about Sudan. So, the special envoy is very active and looking at some of these major conflicts. So, we'll see what happens. But, once the Africa team is in place, hopefully more of these issues will come on the stove, because right now they're all off the stove.
But South Africa has been having so much attention from this administration.
As it should. South Africa has gotten away for decades with, totally trash talking the United States and poking us in the eye. And I used to shake my head. The most heated meeting I had when I was assistant secretary was when I was visited Pretoria and had as we say in diplomacy, a very frank, open, and honest meeting with the South Africans. And I'm delighted to see, the Trump administration finally calling them out. I mean, if the wonderful Nelson Mandela was around today and saw what was happening in South Africa, he would be grieving in his heart.
My South African audience is quite interesting because they are diverse. There are some who think that the United States should not poke their nose into South African affairs, but there are some who think that it was time for maybe a friend to advise them because the country is not going towards the right direction.
Well, here's the bottom line. I don't think anybody should dispute this. South Africa is absolutely, sovereign to pick its friends, to say what it wants, but then we are absolutely sovereign to respond to that the way we want to, and to have the friends that we want. So if South Africa does things that upset the United States and we decide not to trade with them, that is absolutely our sovereign right. As we say in American English, what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
So that is not bullying South Africa to comply, right?
No, absolutely not. Their sovereignty is absolute. They can, do what they want, say what they want, but then we have absolutely the same rights.
It goes both ways. So let's get into the substance of what I wanted us to talk about today, and that is Cameroon elections. In 2018, after the presidential elections in October, your office, the State Department, issued a statement in which they said the irregularities might not have affected the outcome of the elections, but created an impression that the election was not credible or genuinely free and fair. And they went ahead to recommend a modification of the electoral code, electoral legal framework and system to ensure fairness, impartiality, and independence. I don't think anything has changed.
I don't think anything has changed since I was there and personally saw the results of the 1992 elections.
It looks like since 1992, the laws are looking more modern, but the results are getting worse. It looks like.
Okay, Bernard, here's my take. And again, this is mine, not American policy. I consider Cameroon to be what I would call a Potemkin democracy. If you look at it from the front, it looks like a democratic country with all the institutions, with elections. But then if you open the door and look behind it, you start shaking your head. For example, elections are not stolen on election day. Elections are stolen in the process leading up to the election, and then in the process after the election. How do you register the voters? Who are the candidates? Are the parties allowed to go out and campaign and have their events? Does the government try to interfere by co-opting or coercing the opposition by arresting some of their members, by keeping popular people from running? How are the institutions which manage the elections? Are they truly independent, or are they filled with the president's cronies or the ruling party's cronies? Is it a single ballot that has the same, all the candidates on the single ballot, or is it multiple ballots and the opposition ballots mysteriously run out, whereas the government ballots are there, plenty. So, you ask yourself, you look at the Cameroonian situation and you say to yourself, is this serious? Again, my personal point of view, any international organization or other country that puts $1 into the elections is cheating their taxpayers of that dollar. Because anybody wants to bet with me, I'm available to bet, but I will bet you that the outcome of the election is going to be the 92-year-old candidate is going to be the winner, immaterial of how many votes he gets.
Because he's.
Well, yeah, right. And by the way, you were exaggerating when you said that he would be 100 years old when he finished. He would only be 99 years old. So let's not exaggerate. Bernard, when I was ambassador to Ethiopia, I used to shake my head at the naivety of the Europeans, because we were having an election in Ethiopia, and I met with the donors, the donor group, and the Europeans were arguing over how many election observers they should send. And I kind of laughed at them. I said, you people just don't get it. You can have 1 million election observers standing shoulder to shoulder, but if the government in power is not willing to have itself voted out, it's not going to be voted out, and the government's going to win. And that's exactly what happened in Ethiopia. And I predict, again, I'm open to making bets, if it's legal, if it's legal in the country, I'm willing to make a bet as to the outcome of this election.
We'll talk about that bet in a moment. So the elements you listed about the process before and after the elections, the arrest of members of the opposition and keeping people from running and government infiltration into parties and campaigns. Were you trying to describe a situation you think is happening in Cameroon?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
how confident are you in saying that?
Again, personal opinion. I mean, look at what is it? The electoral organization, is it Elecam?
Elecam, yeah.
Yeah. Who are the people on there, or the Constitutional Council? Who are the people on there? How would they rule if if a case is brought to them? Are they going to rule
in Elecam and the Constitutional Council? There are CPDM militants who have resigned from the party and they have taken their oath of office, swearing to be very, very impartial in the performance of their duties.
I'm sure they will be very impartial. Absolutely. But we'll see. But again, looking at Cameroon, there's two sides to this, because the other side is usually if you are running against an entrenched government that has been in power for how long did you say? 42 years?
If it is the government, this government has been in power since independence in the 96 continuation, but the president himself is president since 42 years.
So if you're running against a institution like that, we'll call it an institution, it's suicide to be running multiple candidates. I know the opposition has been trying to get together and have one candidate, but it looks like it's not going to happen. What chance that there would, if there was one opposition candidate that was massively popular, then it may be difficult for the government to quote unquote win the election. But
look at the election. Look at the results of 2018. The president had 72% of the votes. So if all the opposition candidates are put together, what would that change?
Yeah, the question is, was it a clean 72% of the vote?
So what is going to change it? What is going to change it? A single opposition to make the president's victory clean?
Bernard, in my experience in Africa, even a rotten election would constitute X% of the vote, okay? So you can assume that pulling all the levers of power, multiple ballots, the opposition ballots don't show, blah, 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 blah. But you can only steal such a percent of the vote. If you have one person who is massively, massively popular, then it might be very difficult to come out, quote unquote, as the winner. We actually saw this almost happen in 1992. As I said, I was there. I was an election observer. One of the places I went to observe the elections was the headquarters of the Presidential Guard. I was astounded looking at the ballots of the Presidential Guard. The majority of them were for John Fruendi. And I shook my head and I said, oh my gosh, if the Presidential Guard is voting for John Fruendi, this is a done deal. And then, of course, the official, quote unquote, results come in, and what is it, 50 point whatever percent that allegedly went to the president. So
there are a few things I wanted us to talk about. First, yesterday I had a conversation with a cybersecurity expert, with a political activist whose organization is auditing the website of Elecam, and with a cybersecurity lawyer. We're looking at the credibility of the electoralist. First, the electoral code says that Elecam must publish a national elections list before the 30th of December every year. Elecam has never published that. This organization, UPC Manidem, is auditing the website of Elecam and has identified enormous irregularities. So, and the candidates don't have the opportunity to officially audit that website or even have access to the database on the website. And Maurice Kamto sued Elecam to publish that list, but the Constitutional Council has repeatedly said they don't have the mandate to compel Elecam to publish that list. Okay, the law says it clearly, you must publish the list. All the members of the Constitutional Council made that decision because the decision was taken in unanimity. There was no dissenting voice. How would the opposition being in one part against one president change the decision from the Constitutional Council when they are bold enough to say they don't have the mandate that the law and the Constitution actually give to them?
It would be very difficult. And as I said, if a government in power is absolutely unwilling to have itself voted out, then it's not going to happen. Let's look at, I think it was the 2018 elections in Democratic Republic of the Congo. Kabila was intent on staying. It was at that time the pressure from Nikki Haley, who was the United States ambassador to the United Nations, who literally went to Kinshasa and told Kabila, my brother, your time is up. You said that, you're going to leave, so you're going to leave. Of course, Kabila did everything possible to ruin the elections. We had, the three candidates, Fayulu, Tshisekedi, and Shadari, who was Kabila's candidate. And luckily, there was a parallel vote process by the Catholic Church, which is very present throughout DRC. So even if they wanted to push every button for Shadari to win, there was just no way, because I think officially, I forgot if it was like 18, 19% of the vote. I doubt it was that high. But the Catholic Church, by having parallel results, was a good check on the government. So, Kabila took the least of the bad choices. There was no way he was going to allow, Fayulu to be president. So, he ended up kind of passing it on to Tshisekedi. So if it's massive and if the opposition is united, I think that they have a chance. That's all I'll say, is they have a chance.
Absolutely. I was talking with Prince Ekoso and Eric Chinje about this coalition. Prince Ekoso is one of the politicians in Cameroon, and he's been part of the movement that is working to bring them together. He said it's been absolutely difficult for the opposition to rally behind one person, but they are still working on it, hoping that everything is going to be fine. One strategy that Elecam used last time in 2018 was a candidate withdrew a few days to the elections, and Elecam said, okay, we already printed your all the ballot papers, therefore you must run, because we are going to make the ballot papers available at all polling stations. Mm-hmm. And that is a fear now. If everybody withdraws, they're still going to compel them to run at the end of the day.
But again, Bernard, we're talking about all of these niceties. I maintain the bottom line. When all the votes are quote unquote counted, we know what the results are going to be. So, there a lot of discussion and back and forth and this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's a doubt in anyone's mind. And it grieves my heart, because if I was a voter in Cameroon, and if I was really interested in making a change or, expressing myself, I would be extremely frustrated to stand in line for 4 or 5 hours, in the hot sun, or the rainy season pretty well over by then in most of the country, but, in some places it will still be raining. Or if I'm a voter in the Northwest and Southwest and maybe facing violence, or the far north and facing violence, it would be extremely frustrating to put my life on the line, kind of knowing in my soul of souls that the results are pretty well preordained because of all of these games that have been played.
So Beyond Africa podcast should definitely be making a call out to Ambassador Nikki Haley to fly to Yaoundé.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I think the right phone call we are making on this podcast is to Archbishop Andrew Nkeya, the president of the National Episcopal Council. to take his responsibility and act as the bishops of the DRC acted. We actually saw them very active, very forceful, and very committed. We're also talking to Archbishop Cleda, who is also very, very, very forceful. The bishops have written 2 official communiques that they reserved to the government 2 days ago, telling them that Cameroon is in a very bad shape, and the criteria they gave, they outlined 10 criteria for the right president of Cameroon, and none of those would fit President Paul Biya. They need to take this to the next step to ensure that they do what their colleagues in the DRC did. If they don't know what their colleagues in the DRC did, we are willing to bring them to this platform and even connect them to their colleagues in the DRC, because we're not only talking about elections, we're talking about justice, we're talking about peace, we're talking about stability, we're talking about prosperity here regarding elections.
And also, Bernard, in the DRC, the Catholic Church is pretty well universal through the whole country. Cameroon's a little bit different because you're a multi-religious society, more so than the DRC. So, if the religious officials are going to get involved, I think it'd be very important for them to do it, with the major religious leaders, because in the far north, which is overwhelmingly Islamic, and the far north and the north are going to play, fairly significant roles in this election, because in the past that they have been fairly reliable supporters for the CPDM. And this time, it could be quite different. Then you, of course, you have the very tragic situation in Northwest and Southwest. I mean, nobody would like to see violence, and praying that there's not going to be violence from either side. But again, the people are going to be very courageous if there are threats against them, to follow their hearts and to follow the democratic process.
The religious diversity in the country is very important, as you note. And we also want to note that 2 ministers from the north who of different political parties but have always supported the CPDM have resigned, and they are running in the opposition. They are in talks with other political parties to ensure that they could get a coalition candidate. But one never knows that it's politics. One never knows what is going to happen. But we are hoping that the degree of pain and the yearning for change is something they are responding to. So the bishops and all other clergy still have a role to play in this situation, because who else can better fit that situation? You've mentioned the Constitutional Council, you've mentioned arrest, and you've mentioned elimination of candidates. I suppose you are talking about Maurice Kamto here, because my reading of the law says that the Constitutional Council in that decision that eliminated Maurice Kamto. And when I talk with people in certain circles, they tell me, forget about that. That was also done to Trump in the United States, but he succeeded because of the Supreme Court. What do you say?
I say that the situations are totally different. I mean, look at the United States, where you have a separation of powers between the different branches of government, and look at Cameroon, where the executive is absolutely supreme over every other institution of government. I mean, in a country like Cameroon, what the executive wants, the executive gets. Whereas in the United States, you do have the check of the judicial system, which our president is becoming extremely frustrated by, because he is finding out just how, much of a pain the judicial system can be when
the appeal courts are becoming a little bit softer. They are overturning most of those decisions from the district courts.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the United States, the judicial process is always fascinating. So, we'll see how they play out.
Yeah. So in countries where you have observed a strong executive try to perpetuate itself in power, but finally it's taken off, what is always the magic? I don't want to call it bullet. I should have said bullet, but somebody in Yaoundé will say I'm perpetrating a coup d'etat here. What is the magic element that takes these governments out?
Well, unfortunately, as we have seen, it is been the boys in uniform that we now have the coup belt in the Sahel, and we've seen it in some other places, and then we've seen even some more horrible examples you know, people get tremendously frustrated, and they feel like, what are their options? That's why I think that good elections, really, really matter, because it gives the people an opportunity to vent their frustrations and to express their opinions. And I mean, we just have to look at Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon, and going on, not to speak of the horrendous things that are happening in Sudan.
Yeah, you spoke about the Europeans a few moments ago, and in Africa, critiques of African geopolitics, critics of African geopolitics say that the coup in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali is not the same with Gabon and Chad. They argue that Gabon and Chad are palace coups that were perpetrated by France, French relations with Africa, and those were perpetrated to entrench the powers because they are aligned with French interests in Africa. So they kind of make this different. And looking at Cameroon, some people say if any coup d'etat happens in Cameroon today is going to be a palace coup as happens in Gabon and in Chad.
Yeah, I hate talking about coups, and I thought about this a lot when they happen in Bamako and Niamey and Ouagadougou. And one of the things, we use the word democracy, and obviously a coup is undemocratic. But I'm starting to think that, given Africa's unique status of trying to overcome colonialism, and then these dinosaurs that have hung around for decades and decades and decades and went through phony elections, I'm starting to think that a word that might be more important is legitimacy. In the eyes of the people, who do they see as the legitimate government? And I would maintain, and I know this would be very controversial, but I would maintain that when the people in Bamako first overthrew the government that had been elected in a highly questionable election, that they were actually seen as legitimate by the majority of the people. Now, unfortunately, one of the problems with legitimacy of military governments is that they tend to very quickly become illegitimate in the eyes of the people, because many times they're worse than the people they kicked out. But you have to ask yourself, in situations where the people are frustrated election after election after election, and they see no way out of this, what recourse do they really have?
The question comes back to legitimacy and legality, because we'll do everything to be legal and stay in power because the Constitutional Council has said this and that is the law. But now the question of legality, of legitimacy, becomes even more important, because people want to live a life of freedom, a life of prosperity. I mean, a life that gives them the basic human dignity that they need. And I want to circle this back to President Trump's priority. Of course, America is supposed to defend their interest first before even thinking about our own interest, which could be incidental to our security, or our own interest could be incidental to American interest. Ambassador Trump said the United States was going to operate with a country of priorities. He called them priority countries. He did not give the basic details of how the commercial diplomacy is going to be. But when you look at Cameroon and the current state of the democracy, the economy, and geostrategic location, do you see any element of priority in Cameroon?
I absolutely see an element of potential priority. Ambassador Fittrell won a big award last year when he was ambassador in Guinea for bringing $1 billion of trade and investment between Guinea and the United States. Okay, that's amazing. Guinea has minerals, and I was ambassador to Guinea, so I like. But that is amazing for a very small country. Cameroon is a much bigger country than Guinea. It has a much bigger economy. What does Cameroon not have? what we would call a equal playing field where an American investor who comes out and gets into a dispute is not going to automatically lose that dispute in the courts to the nephew or the cousin of the judge. You see what I'm saying? For Cameroon to achieve its potential, aside from sweetheart deals from certain investors, they really have to have a transparent legal system and a transparent investment code, and most importantly, a transparent taxation system. Because one thing I found out to my shock when I was Assistant Secretary of State and I visited Yaoundé and I talked to American business people there, do you know that the Cameroonian taxing agents get a bonus based on how much they claim that a company owes? Not what the company actually owes, or not what the company actually ends up paying in back taxes, but what they claim that the company owes. And I pointed that out to the president when I met with him. And I said, Mr. President, if you really, really want serious American investments, then please fix up this goofy tax system. I'm assuming that it was never fixed, and I'm assuming it's still the same way.
I don't know much about the taxation system, but I don't think something has changed towards that regard. Yeah. So talking about American businesses and American interest and transparency, one of President Trump's ambitions is to counter China and take over the markets across the continent. Now, Cameroon has been going to the east a lot, dealing with China, India, and all the other countries, but principally with China. Is that an area that can be of interest to President Trump? Because we have already mentioned the transparency problem and the legal system that are not really helpful.
And the corruption. Let's not forget the corruption.
And the corruption, yeah.
When I was chargé d'affaires in Cameroon, I'll never forget that we had a very potential American business person who wanted to invest. And at that time, $20 million was a lot of money. And he was shaken down by a gendarme on the road from Douala to Yaoundé. And he basically said, "The hell with this, I'm leaving." He went right back to Douala and got on, that kind of. With President Trump, he doesn't want to replace China across the continent. What the United States desperately needs is to get our foot in the door on the strategic minerals and the strategic commodities, which are essential for the global economy of the 21st century. What I'll call the electric economy, which right now China has a monopoly of 80, 90% of some of these critical, what we call rare earth minerals. And they have done this very cleverly. I applaud, their tactics in doing this. The United States was caught flat-footed. We let the Chinese, run circles around us, and it's time to catch up. So those countries which have strategic minerals, number one amongst them is Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is actually the richest country on earth when it comes to mineral wealth of $37 trillion. We need to be there and get into those deals. But I don't think the United States is ever going to be doing the massive ports and airports and railroads and, things like that.
So if the United States is not going to be doing all those, the infrastructural development, how is the American perception in Africa going to be? Because that is what is increasing the Chinese perception or reputation in Africa. Yeah,
well, there are other countries that can do them besides China. And a lot of the countries that have done some of these airport, port, road, railroad deals are now realizing that, they were left with not the highest quality and a lot of debt that somebody's grandchildren are going to have to be paying. So, but there are other countries that are absolutely first rate when it comes to doing infrastructure. I'm not plugging any countries. I'm just thinking India, Turkey, some of the Arab countries. I mean, the UAE does phenomenal port deals. I visited the port that they financed in Somaliland. It was a phenomenal port. So there are a lot of countries out there. I mean, in that regard, the Africans are in the driving seat, but they have to take advantage of it. The one thing the Chinese are very clever at doing is co-opting key people in these countries. So when it comes time to pick a contractor, wow, miracle of miracles, it's always the Chinese person that gets picked. And we won't talk about any envelopes that are left behind, but
a friend who was the tenant of the driver of the Minister of Finance once told me how money moves around, and it's amazing. Anyway, but one thing I would like, maybe this is a question for Ambassador Troy, not for you, is with this commercial diplomacy of rare earths, critical minerals, is the United States thinking about any level of transformation of these minerals within the continent? Because if there is no transformation within the continent, it does not relatively change anything.
Well, okay, that's a fantastic question. Because if Africa wants to achieve middle income status and beyond, then there has to be value added. People are not going to get rich by artisanal mining. A lot of people are going to die in terrible circumstances, and the environment's going to get screwed up. So yes, absolutely. I'm thinking, and my understanding is that the deal between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo may in fact involve processing in Rwanda, from Eastern Congo, so that both regions will have buy-in to maintain the peace for that type of an arrangement. Because we have thought all along, even when I was there, that economics is going to be a huge component of eventual peace in Eastern Congo, because I visited Eastern Congo, I visited Goma, I visited Rwanda, I took the land route, from Kigali to Goma, and I talked to a lot of the business people, and they were just so optimistic about Eastern Congo if and only if there can be peace and stability. And Eastern Congo is much, much closer to Kigali than it is to Kinshasa.
Yeah, and most people have heard about the Project 2025 document, and I know many people have not read it. You and I have discussed it on this platform. I have read the section on Africa which you wrote.
No, I did. Okay. I want the record to show, I contributed. I did not write the whole section, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's an amazing document for any African who thinks about the development of Africa, because it changes the perspective of African-American relations and focuses it on trade and investment. And when you give this example of you traveling from Rwanda to Goma and even within Cameroon and talking about the realities of the problems we face, these are things that elude the common man who only listen to the media to hear what happens. But when you start touching the realities of what drives American foreign policy, you see that President Trump's current foreign policy is actually grounded on something that could help both Africa and the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Bernard, when we came into power during Trump 1, we had a heart-to-heart discussion amongst ourselves in the Africa Bureau, and we came out to say the number one issue in Africa is the young people of Africa, because the population is growing so fast that the most important thing is going to be jobs for the young people, that it's all about jobs and young people, because there's two possibilities. If they're frustrated, if they don't get the jobs that they see other people in other parts of the world have, it's going to be violence, conflict, war, and millions of people migrating to Europe. On the other hand, if Africa can develop economically and the young people have opportunities, economic opportunities as entrepreneurs or as professionals, then Africa will boom like no continent has ever boomed, and it will contribute significantly to all of the positive things of the 21st century. And that's why we came through with Prosper Africa, We doubled the capitalization for the Development Finance Corporation, things like that. But there was no new administration. We were done in 3 years and had to be out of there. And then, of course, the focus totally shifted to, and I've been very tough on the Biden administration's Africa policy because I called it, megaphone diplomacy, that you go around and tell everybody what they're doing wrong. And gee, isn't that a wonderful way to make friends and influence people? To tell them how they're screwing up. So I'm happy that the new Trump administration hopefully will finish or pursue what we had envisioned of using trade and investment as an incentive to get African governments to clean up their acts where it comes to corruption and dealing with a level playing field and on and on and on. Because the point I made was, even then, I visited some of the African heads of state I visited were out and out despots and dictators, but they were scared also because they could look outside their walls, their presidential palace, and see all the angry young people on the streets of their capital cities. This really came home to me when I visited my old friend Alpha Conde in Guinea, because he had been the opposition leader when I was ambassador, and he was in power. And in Conakry, you could feel the hostility on the streets, and sure enough, he was overthrown by that frustration. And so African leaders better get the message that their young people are just not going to put up with it. And the only way that they can get around this is to provide economic opportunities to their own young people and stop the cronyism and the corruption and, the sweetheart deals, and let the general population partake in the riches that they certainly are partaking in.
Yeah, talking about young people and the governance, when you visited President Biya as the Undersecretary of African Affairs, did you talk to him about this very situation?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to. I wasn't going to get anywhere, because when you have a regime that's entrenched for decades and decades and decades, I mean, it's built on elites, it's built on sweetheart deals, it's built on, privilege. So, and we may get 9 more years of it.
So some people actually argue that the president of Cameroon, Paul Biya, is already very frail and weak and cannot rule the country again. When you met with him in 2018, did he show any signs of frailty as compared to the person you knew before?
Not to me, but I'll tell you what, I'm 76 years old and I'm frail and not as sharp as I used to be. And, that's 76, and you're talking about somebody who's 92. So you can do a lot to improve on nature, but you can't hold it in abeyance forever.
He's as sharp as a tack.
Yeah.
We heard that a lot over the last 4 years here.
And, I will never question somebody else's health, because that's, our former president was questioned, President Biden. Now they're questioning, President Trump. I think he's 78 or 79. So, people should be true to themselves and know if they can do a certain thing or not. I've retired 4 times. I don't think I'm up to going back again, in that kind of a job, because it's the last job I had was like a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week job. And you can do it when you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s. But then when you get in your 70s, you have to take a breath.
Some Cameroonians who are listening to us now are hoping that in September, some nominations that are going back to Congress are going to have your name, because they want somebody who understands the situation somewhere around DC.
No, all done. I'll make trouble this way. Now I can express my honest opinion, so the words coming out of my mouth are my own. And I always laugh because I do some posting on X, and I'm always accused of being a lobbyist, and I have to laugh at that because, never would I take money, never, for for promoting a cause. I only promote causes that I truly believe in. And I loved Cameroon when I was there. It is in my heart. I would love nothing than the best for the Cameroonian people, because I know that Cameroon could not just be, yeah, it's middle income officially, but let's be real. Cameroon could be as prosperous as any country in Europe, with the riches that it has and the tremendous human capital of the Cameroonian people. So, it is. I am so sorry that it is such a constricted political system, and it looks like we're going to get more of the same.
I see all the reactions to your post regarding Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somaliland, Somalia, and Cameroon. I see how people react to that, and I talk to you both on screen and off screen, and I know how I know where you stand on these issues. But one thing that we the non-diplomats always struggle to understand with diplomats is, when you're in office, your language doesn't really sound as when you're out of office, and that keeps us confused.
No, well, it can, because when you're in office, you are promoting not your own policies, but you're promoting the policies of your country. In America's case, you're promoting the policies of the administration, of the president. American ambassadors, and this is a very important point for people to understand, American ambassadors are the president's personal representative. They don't represent Congress. They don't represent the Supreme Court. They don't represent, state governors. They represent the President of the United States. So you either support that policy, or you shut up, or you resign. And, we always have people that they feel so strongly about something that they're going to resign. One of the first examples I can point to is when I was a diplomat, apartheid in South Africa. The United States had a policy called constructive engagement that a lot of people disagreed with, because it was trying to talk the apartheid regime into turning power over to Black South Africans. And it was going nowhere. So I had several friends who said, I cannot promote that policy, so I'm leaving. And this happened most recently with what's going on in Gaza. We've had some people leaving. So when you're in the office, you represent the president, and you have to represent the president's views.
Since that is the situation, tell me what President Trump thinks about Cameroon. What were you representing? I
have not a clue.
But you were representing him in the first mandate.
Oh, in that mandate? Oh,
yeah.
Well, basically, the president doesn't have an opinion on everything. The president often will say, okay, these are my broad policies, so, do what you need to do to implement them. And at that time, again, we were trying to promote trade and investment. We wanted an open environment. We cared about the elections, and that's what we were pursuing. But if you remember, also at that time, the security situation was really dicey in the far north. So
and in
there was
the Anglophone regions.
Well, there were two very separate issues, because in the far north, we were supporting the government's efforts to stop Boko Haram. In the southwest and northwest, we were trying to get the government of Cameroon to respect the civil rights of the population and the human rights of the population. But at the same time, the United States policy was to oppose violence no matter who was committing it. Because I'll tell you what, I would go in, I would talk to the Cameroonians, and I would show them horrible things that the gendarmes and the military were doing. And then they would whip out a book and show me horrible things that they said that the separatists were doing. At the end of the day, that poor person who is murdered, or the poor woman who is raped, does it really matter who does it? Because the act is horrendous.
But here you had the levers of putting pressure on the parties. Was it not time to put pressure on the parties at that moment to get this thing to end?
Well, here was the problem. With the government of Cameroon, it's one party, right? There's one government of Cameroon. On the other side, there were multiple multiple parties who all claim to be speaking on behalf of Southwest, Northwest, or Ambazonians, whatever phrase we want to use. So it was very difficult. I refused, by the way, to receive any of the Ambazonia delegations because when you're in my position, you either see none or all of them, and they were lining up wanting to talk to the Assistant Secretary of State. So, it's unfortunately one of those situations where if you're going to have a resolution, it's going to have to be an honest, face to face, and it would help the situation if there was one representative on both sides of the table.
Yeah, but I know we're running out of time. I'm so sorry. It's always very interesting with you. So with the Cameroonian situation, 2018 till today, we know France has a very strong influence in the former colonies. So how did you navigate the situation between the United States foreign policy by President Trump, French influence, and French interest within that situation?
I had very frank and honest and diplomatese discussions with my French counterpart, who I respected, very professional, very knowledgeable. My first day on the job, I had a phone call with him. He was leaving for the traditional French August recess, but I had one phone call with him, and I said, when you get back, my very first issue and the only issue I brought up to him was Cameroon, because I went into office in pain over Cameroon. Again, going back to what I said earlier, when I worked in Yaoundé, I traveled all over Cameroon and I saw what a phenomenal potential the country can have if it's stable, if it's at peace, and if it has a government that exercises honest governance.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tibor Nagy, for coming to the Beyond Africa podcast again. Do you have any last word for Cameroonians as they rush to the polls on October 12, 2025?
Pray for peace, wisdom, and honesty. And may God touch all of those who can do something about the situation.
We hope the United States can do something about the situation, and God is touching the United States authorities.
From your lips to God's ears.
Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching the Beyond Africa podcast with me, Ngalim Bernard, and my guest, Ambassador Tibor Nagy. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment so we know how we are doing. And we wish very peaceful elections in the months ahead.